Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so I'll give it one more minute. I've just been hanging out here with the Bill of Rights. Yeah, I like the virtual backgrounds.
Is the quiz up yet?
No, that's going to be on my list of announcements. So I'm going to extend it another day or two. I usually have that be a short answer quiz. And so I realized this morning, oh shoot, I got to write some like multiple choice things. So, okay. You know, because we usually do it in class, but okay. So, got some announcements. So, also, actually, today I'm actually going to remember to record. Okay. So last time we talked about interpretive theories, and we talked about, your book clumps them into four interpretive theories: originalism, which looks to history when the meaning of the Constitution is ambiguous. And there's two flavors of originalism. That first flavor of originalism is about understanding, looking for the intent of the authors, and to writing of those who were at the Constitutional Convention or those who wrote about it and defending it and trying to get it ratified. The optional originalist approach is to try to figure out what the original public understanding of the Constitution was. And so for that, you might look to the ratification debates or anything, if it was something else, anything written at the time that a particular part of the Constitution was maybe added later in amendments, but it looked to what people who weren't involved with the writing of it wrote. How did they understand it? Proceduralism suggests that if you look at those core procedural things in the Constitution, a democratic process with free and fair elections, due process, if you consider those procedures, and if the court protects those and interprets things in light of protecting procedure, that's how you should fill in the spots where the Constitution is ambiguous. A moral reading of the Constitution suggests that if you look collectively at the Constitution and some of the other founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, that there are certain core values, so equality, liberty, and so forth. And if you fill in the ambiguous parts where it's a little bit ambiguous, if you keep those core values in mind and look to that, that's how you should interpret the Constitution. And then the last interpretation is pragmatism, which suggests that it's great to try to understand the Constitution, but when you're employing where the words are clear, all of these theories are the same. Where the words are clear, you just apply the words. But with the pragmatic approach says that when you need to use an interpretive theory, that you would be well to keep in mind that, you would do well to keep in mind that, and look to the fact that this is going to impact real people, and temper your interpretation with pragmatic considerations of the impact it'll have out in the world. We also discussed why there isn't some sort of, if these rights in the Bill of Rights, and that's the content of this constitutional law class, because we're talking about constitutional law and civil liberties, and most of what we would consider civil liberties in the Constitution are actually in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. If they're so important, why weren't they included in the Constitution in the first place? Why did they have to be added? And we talked about two basic reasons. One, they thought it was unnecessary. They said, look, the national government actually isn't even strong enough to violate individual liberties, and the governments that will be dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, the state governments already have bills of rights, and so it's kind of superfluous. The next reason why they didn't include it is some thought that bills of rights were dangerous, because if you go about the business of laying down a set of rights, a couple of incorrect conclusions can come about. Madison said, look, these aren't grants from the government. If you make a Bill of Rights, it almost looks like the government is presenting a gift or a grant to the people, where these are inherent God-given rights. And the only reason sometimes we write it down is to acknowledge that these are natural rights that people have. But inevitably, you're gonna not include something in the list, and later on, people are going to think that things not on the list are not quite as important as the things that made the list. And then a couple of announcements. The pages of the textbook, the core pages that deal with the theories of interpretation, I copied and posted to D2L, and I posted them in a couple of different formats. I thought a PDF would be good, but it was blurry in that. So I also posted it as a Word document and then just as a long web page. And then related to that, I haven't gotten the quiz uploaded and ready yet. So I'll get that done today, but I'll give you another day or two on the other end, and I'll make an announcement about that when I get it done. Today, we're going to start off by talking about the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. And then we're going to, the rest of the semester, we're going to pick a few of the rights in the Bill of Rights to really study the evolution of and to go into very deeply. But before we do that, I'd like to go over the entire Bill of Rights, just so we have a sense of the scope of what's in the Bill of Rights. And what I'd like you to be able to do is be familiar with the rights in the Bill of Rights. So if someone, were to say, what are the rights in the basic rights in the Fourth Amendment, you would be able to identify, oh, well, that includes the right against unreasonable search and seizure, and it says what has to be in a warrant before it will be considered a valid warrant, things like that. Does anybody have any questions about anything? And right now, I can only see a few boxes. I guess I could stop sharing and look at you. Anybody questions? Oh, that's not good. Rachel, no worries. Get your car fixed. Okay. Okay. So in normal everyday conversation, we tend to use the phrase civil liberties and civil rights interchangeably. But there actually is a difference. The bulk of this course is on civil liberties, although because we don't have a separate course on civil rights, we cover some civil rights in this course as well. So when you think of civil liberties, you can think of civil liberties and civil rights as a conception of negative rights and positive rights. And what I mean by that is not negative and positive as in good and bad, but negative and positive as in negative being an absence of something and positive being the presence of something. So when we're talking about civil liberties, the way that the right is protected is for government just to keep out of that sphere of life. So the good example would be the rights articulated in the First Amendment, the right of expression and the right of religious liberty. The way the right is protected is when government doesn't get into that sphere and muck around. So it doesn't make laws limiting speech. It doesn't make laws limiting the religious freedom. When we talk about positive rights mean that government actually would have to do something to protect those rights. Staying out of it isn't enough. That isn't enough to make sure that the right happens, because there might be other forces. Sometimes government is the only impediment to a right, so government can just stay out of it. Sometimes there are other forces that might impede the right. So with positive rights, government has to do more than just stay out of it. Government actually has to do something to make sure that the right manifests. So the right to free and fair elections, government usually has to do more than stay out of it to make sure that procedures are fair. The right to be free of discrimination, government usually has to do more than just not be discriminatory, because society might still continue to be discriminatory. Sometimes government has to do more. So civil liberties are protections against government actions, whereas civil rights are protections that are enforced by government actions. Okay, so let's go on to take a quick run through the Bill of Rights. And again, this is just a real quick overview, and then we're going to pick a couple of these and spend time looking at how the court interprets them. So, and the way I like to do it is I read through the amendment real quick, and then we break it down and look at its parts. So the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition government for redress of grievances. So it breaks down into 6 rights, 2 double sets of rights. So we have the religious liberties. Congress is not going to create make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And essentially what this is promising is that there's not going to be an official church. There's a lot of disagreement over all of these, but there's a whole lot of disagreement about the Establishment Clause. The areas of agreement would be, we know for sure that it means that there won't be an official church, or Congress won't monetarily sponsor a particular church. And that was a reaction to Great Britain, because Great Britain did have the Anglican Church as its official church. So in order to hold public office, you had to be a member of the Anglican Church. So they didn't want to have that. Beyond just no official church, and another example might be, Congress is perfectly free to declare an official bird, an official flower, an official flag, but Congress could not say the official church of the United States is, the Baptist Church or whatever. We also would agree that the Establishment Clause stands for the proposition of some degree of separation between church and state. Where we start to disagree is how much separation. So some people, some of you might be thinking, well, isn't it supposed to be like a wall of separation? And that was one person's interpretation, but that's not in the Constitution, that phrase, wall of separation. That was a phrase that came out of a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote when he was president. The Danbury Baptist Church had written him a letter when he was president and said, don't you think you ought to declare a national day of prayer? And Jefferson wrote back expressing his feelings about the relationship between the national government and church by saying, no, I actually don't think that's a good idea. I think there should be a wall of separation between church and state. When he was talking about state at that time, he was talking about the national government, because when the Bill of Rights was written, states did, some of them have established churches. About half of them did. And so the Bill of Rights wasn't meant to get rid of states doing it. It was meant to get rid of the national government doing it. So yeah, Thomas Jefferson thought there should be a wall of separation between the federal government and church. But there were differing views on this. And so we still today are arguing about the degree of separation between church and state. And every year on the docket, the Supreme Court hears yet another case that tries to refine further still how much separation should there be. The other religious clause, the free exercise clause, it is a little simpler in some ways. It just says that government shouldn't be able to interfere with your practice of religion, nor should you suffer consequences if you don't practice religion at all. You shouldn't be forced to observe a religion either. So taken together, with these two clauses, in some ways they cut in opposite direction. And sometimes there can be some tension between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Because on the one hand, the Establishment Clause tends to suggest separation from religion. But the Free Exercise Clause cuts the other way and suggests freedom of religion, even in the public square, the public sphere. And so sometimes you get cases where those two clauses are kind of at odds with one another. And so that's in part why we still have so many decisions yet refining the meaning of those two clauses. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those two religious clauses. The expression clauses, Congress is not going to abridge the freedom of speech or the press. It's not going to abridge written speech nor spoken speech. And then, of course, the controversy here is, well, if we say Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, does it mean that government can never do anything that burdens expression? And as a society, we've decided no, government can at times burden expression. I mean, there have been justices, Justice Hugo Black didn't say it quite this way, but in some of his opinions, he'd say, what part of Congress shall make no law do you not understand? It's no law. But most of the justices, and always a majority, have recognized that there's some laws that can burden the freedom of speech. And we'll also be talking a bit about the First Amendment, the expression clauses of the First Amendment. And then finally, these last two clauses are also a part of expressive freedom because taken together, the people have the right to peacefully assemble and to petition government for redress of grievances, which essentially those two clauses taken together are the right of peaceful protest. So it's not only that you have the right not only to expression, words and ideas, the Constitution protects a certain degree of expressive conduct. It's one thing, I can tell Congress that I think their laws are not good. I can write an editorial in the paper, I can give speeches about it, but the Constitution goes further and says, I don't have to hope that my words get to Congress. I don't have to hope that they read the newspaper or read the letter that I send them. I can get together with like-minded people and we can go stand out in front of Congress where Congress would have to see us as when they walked by to get into the building. And I can, put it on a sign, I can yell it to them. And as long as it's peaceful and as long as I don't block their entrance into the building, I have the right to do that as well. So that's an extension of our expression rights. And so it's a lot packed into the First Amendment. Taken together, you could say that they protect rights of conscience. Now, one of the things I like to do when I talk about the Bill of Rights is I do this little bit of talking about it. And then a few years ago, Time Magazine made a series of like 2 and 3 minute videos about each of the amendments. And so I like to then show the short video after each one. So, oh, and I have to click the box.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion,
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof,
or abridging the freedom of speech,
or of the press,
or of the press,
or of the right of the people peaceably
peaceably to assemble,
and to petition the government for redress of grievances.
and to petition the government for redress of grievances.
There's something really sensibly first about our First Amendment. Our whole system of government really depends on free speech and free press.
Our Constitution and our Bill of Rights all harken back to what the colonists experienced under the monarch.
In the course of the conflict leading up to the Revolution, Americans saw a genuine conspiracy in England to deprive not only Americans but English citizens of fundamental rights of free speech and free press.
We just had a revolution, and so the framers understood how important it was to have speech and assembly in order to foster revolution and keep the government honest.
You can't have a democracy, you can't have a republic, you can't have elections, you can't really have a fair system of self-government without free speech and free press.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion,
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion,
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof,
Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
One of the reasons that Americans have properly been adamant about the importance of separation of church and state is that Americans were and are an intensely religious people. And we also, among us, display a great diversity of religious belief. The diversity of religious belief is a potentially explosive and disruptive issue in our body politic. And the Founding Fathers, they knew that religion would cause nothing but disruption and trouble in politics were it to be enshrined in the Constitution.
And indeed, the original First Amendment says Congress can't mess with religion, but actually states are allowed to have established churches.
Most colonies had state-supported established religions. In all of the southern colonies, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was the established state-supported church of those colonies. In New England, it was the Congregational Church or the Presbyterian Church.
Basically, some states had established churches, other states didn't have established churches, and the First Amendment said, Congress butt out.
Congress shall make no law,
Congress shall make no law,
Or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press,
or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble,
and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
I think the First Amendment, more than almost any of the amendments, is a dissenter's amendment. Although many of the amendments over time get to be interpreted consistent with public opinion, the folks that win First Amendment cases are often the dissenters, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists or alleged communists, the people that want to speak back to the government and say, this isn't right, you should change your policy. Lots of people don't like to see the American flag burned, but the court came to the conclusion, despite legislation by the states and by Congress, that people have a right to burn a flag because it's a powerful message about disagreement with what the government is doing.
So one may protest because of freedom of speech, but they may not protest and destroy the properties of others. And that's very important. The idea to protest against what the government is doing, and yet at the same time understanding that your protest has limitations as well.
These First Amendment freedoms, which originally had been protected only against Congress, came to be protected against states because of the 14th Amendment. States have to protect free speech and free press, and also free exercise of religion. Before the Civil War, Southern states made it a crime to preach against slavery, even in the pulpit. They had put preachers in prison. They had threatened them literally with capital punishment for preaching against slavery. Remember how the First Amendment began? Congress shall make no law abridging freedom. 14th Amendment says states can't make any laws abridging freedom, because after the Civil War it was clear that we needed a second Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights against the states. And that's actually really the Bill of Rights that we have today.
I truly believe the First Amendment has kept this country together. It's unified the country, and it's kept it from battles over religion, battles over speech, battles that have taken place, but it has not defeated the country.
Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, petition, assembly. We get to tell government what to do. They are public servants. They work for us. They can't tell us to shut up. The First Amendment's deep, deep idea is here the people rule.
Okay. So the Second Amendment, this is probably the amendment that is actually, in the last few years, probably the one that more people would be able to name by number, and they kind of know what it says. So, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This one means there's been controversy over it. It was the most recent of the rights in the Bill of Rights to become incorporated to apply to the states as well as the national government. It wasn't until 2010. And we'll talk more about that. But this one, you know, the debate over it has been, is it a right of individuals to own guns, or is it kind of a right of states to protect themselves against a tyrannical federal government? And in 2010, the court said it's an individual's right. And so it now applies to the state governments as well as the national government. And actually, let me go ahead and share the video of the Second Amendment.
A well-regulated militia.
A well-regulated militia.
Being necessary to the security of a free state.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Shall not be infringed.
Shall not be infringed.
When I read the Bill of Rights, that's what I see. People who have empowered themselves through defeating a superpower with a ragtag militia. It's amazing. It's absolutely an amazing story.
It was about the states being able to raise armies to protect themselves, in part against the federal government. They were really worried about the federal government having a standing army, an overweening force, and so the states could call up their militia anytime they needed to restrain the federal government.
That was the best security of liberty. When the people who held power got to be too tyrannical, you could gather together into a militia, take up arms, and repel a tyranny.
A well-regulated militia.
Being necessary to the security.
Necessary to the security of a free state.
The Second Amendment is basically saying we are helpless against this power unless we have something that allows us to fight it, and that is the ability to keep arms.
The very idea of a militia today is somewhat strange to us, but that's the way American armies were organized in the 18th century in each of the separate colonies.
after the Civil War, Americans basically rethought the Second Amendment. They don't believe in state militias anymore. Local governments, state governments, waged war not against a tyranny, but against a duly elected government. And whose bullets basically were flying? The bullets of state militias. So does that mean that they just rejected the Second Amendment completely? No. They recast it, they reimagined it. They reconceptualized the Second Amendment, not as a states' rights idea, but as an individual rights idea.
The right of the people.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
One thing the Bills of Rights did not talk about, of course, was the right to carry AK-47s.
Weapons are very different today than they were at the founding. And so one question is, does the founding vision, does the Reconstruction vision still make sense today?
The right to bear arms was considered to be one of those vital, fundamental liberties that Americans had inherited from their English forebears. But the world in which 18th century Americans were living was a very different world from ours today.
Okay, so we're going to talk now about the Third Amendment. So, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. And so this amendment comes out of the American experience with the British soldiers leading up to the War for Independence. I think one of the interesting things is that this amendment doesn't, it protects less than you probably think that it does, because we just can't imagine troops being kept in our private homes at any time. But if you look at it, it actually only, it says that in times of peace, you can't be forced to put up soldiers in your home, although you could with your own consent. And even in wartime, it can still be done, but it would have to be through a law by Congress. Essentially what it's getting at is it's protecting against generals out in the field, out, you know, if there were a war on these borders or these shores, they couldn't just force people to put up soldiers. Now, this is, you know, this came out of the experience where at times as the War for Independence in the years preceding the War for Independence, as tensions ratcheted up between Great Britain and the colonies, there were times when you know, if you'll recall, it was a series of, Parliament would pass a new tax, the colonists would get upset and not pay the taxes, and sometimes even go further than not paying the taxes. They'd get kind of rebel-y. And so the British reaction was to send troops over to try to get the colonists to settle down. And so during one of those events where the colonists were acting up, you know, we had the so-called Boston Massacre. And after that event, Great Britain sent an additional 4,000 troops to Boston. And Boston was a city of 16,000 at the time. So it was like they sent a whole quarter of the population, and they were housed in private people's homes. The British really didn't see what the problem was. We were all British citizens, and back in Great Britain, that was just what had been done since time immemorial. If the island was being attacked, and the king would get together soldiers, and of course you would put up the king's soldiers in your home. That was part of us, you know, that was part of your effort to the war. This felt different because it wasn't, you know, it wasn't like colonists fighting with other colonists. It was people from Great Britain who were coming. So it felt like an us and them situation rather than we're all in this together fighting against an outside enemy. And when the British troops were housed in people's homes, it felt like more than an inconvenience. It felt like a privacy violation, because if people were complaining about the policies of Great Britain, soldiers would tell that to their commanding officers. And so in some ways, they were almost like spies eavesdropping on what people thought. And so that was what led to us not wanting to house troops in our homes. But, I think that now, this first part, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. I could easily see that where people would be accepting if during one of these natural disasters, they were to say, hey, we're coming after this hurricane to help. If anybody would like to do their part by allowing, somebody of the National Guard to live there, I think people would be willing to, but our culture has just gone so far from that. And the United States Army was the first military to perfect the ability to be able to set up a place to live, a virtual city in an afternoon. So we don't get anywhere near the borders of the Third Amendment. And in fact, there are no Supreme Court cases dealing squarely with the Third Amendment because we've never had an allegation that it was being violated. There's a little bit of Supreme Court humor that I have associated with the Third Amendment. Several years ago, I was working on a paper and I contacted this constitutional law scholar, John Hart Ely, and he was retired at the time, but I said, I've read some of your work and I'm working on something similar to what you did. Would you be willing to chat on the phone with me for a while? And he sent me a very kind email and said, sure, I'm not on campus much anymore, so here's my home phone number. So I called him at his home phone number, and the first time I called, I got an answering machine. And the answering machine said, hello, you've reached John Hart Ely, president of the Institution for the Study of the Third Amendment. And then he paused and, of course, I'm nerdy enough to know that what the Third Amendment is off the top of my head and that there has never been. I'm thinking, what is there to study that you would have a whole institute? And then after a pause, he says, if you suspect somebody is quartering troops in your home without your permission, please leave me a message. Okay, Supreme Court, fun, humor, it's a very thin book, but I'll be here all week. Okay, so let's take a look at, one more just anecdote. During World War II, when there were American troops stationed in Great Britain, they were put up in the private homes of individuals, so kind of one of these ironies of history. And the British people were very grateful for any help they could get in the war. However, having anyone in your home for long periods of time when it wasn't really your idea gets old. And so a slogan kind of developed about the soldiers. They were paid more than British soldiers and they were away from home. So on payday, they'd go out and get drunk and womanize and, kind of act the way people do when they're young and away from home for the first time. And so the slogan came to be about the American GIs. They're overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Anyway, they add that to the very slim book of constitutional law humor. So.
Before we go, can I ask something quick?
Of course.
I was just wondering, this is more of like a hypothetical kind of thing, but since basically there's really only ever been one conflict on American soil, if there was ever a situation like the Civil War again where there was fighting that happened like on American home front, something like, whenever soldiers going through areas would like steal food from like farms or something, would that be more in like, because I don't know if that's necessarily outlined, if someone wanted to punish that, would that be more in the Third Amendment or in the like government can't take property without reimbursing you kind of thing?
I like the way you're thinking. That is interesting. I do think that would probably fall under a takings clause scenario, because yeah, especially if for whatever reason they're going through an area and for whatever reason they don't have the access to the MREs or cut off or something, and they raided a grocery store or a field, picked all the vegetables. Government can seize private property, but it has to compensate. So yeah, I think that would be more of a Fifth Amendment claim. But I love that question. So
I have a question as well, if you don't mind.
Of course.
So back in June, when the National Guard was called into DC, there was a lot of conversation about the Third Amendment related to them being quartered in hotels that were actually shut down for coronavirus concerns. Do you think any of that concern was actually warranted?
It was peacetime. Presumably they had the permission of the hotel owners. In fact, this is just me thinking off the top of my head because I don't know, but I would think if I were a hotel owner that had to have my hotel shut down because of the pandemic, I'd think, oh, look, paying customers, and be only too glad, because I'm sure that they paid. So if they, let's look at the wording again. I'm going to continue to be thinking about your question, but
I know there was concern as well over the fact that DC is not a statehood. So if specific rights actually apply to them?
Well, in this case, it would, because it doesn't have anything to do with state governments. It's just private homes, and you can have a private home in DC. But let me, there I am. So the reason I was looking at without the consent of the owner, it doesn't, I was wondering if there was something quartered in any house. I think a hotel would probably fall under this. I think as long as the owners, it was a time of peace. And I think as long as they gave permission, that would probably be okay. But I mean, the interesting thing is I can do these little thumbnail analysis, but sometimes you never know, a fact turns a little bit differently, and then things get interpreted differently. So that's a great question too. I like the questions. This is awesome. Okay. So let's take a look. Oops, I wish I'd quit doing that. At the Fourth Amendment. Oh no, let's look at, I'm sorry. Let's watch the movie on the Third Amendment. That's not what I meant to.
Oblique to the right.
No soldier shall,
No soldier shall, in time of peace,
Be quartered in any house
without the consent of the owner.
The Third Amendment reflected fear of the central government and a standing army.
no soldier shall,
No soldier shall, in time of peace,
be quartered in any house,
without the consent of the owner.
nor in a time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law.
Why were there so much anxiety 200 years ago about the government quartering troops in people's houses? History. The British had done it.
The British had the nerve to order American households in Boston and actually also in New York and Philadelphia that they quarter British troops in their houses.
Think about this. The soldiers arrive with the power of a king. Bang on the door. Bam, 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 bam. open up in the name of the king. And then they are allowed to come in and they sit where they want to sit, they eat what they want to eat, they get up and leave.
Without the consent.
Without the consent.
Without the consent of the owner.
Today, we're a lot less fearful of the Army than the framers were. We think that the Army isn't them, but us. Part of the reason why is the Civil War proved that the Army could actually be a pro-liberty, pro-freedom institution rather than something that threatened liberty and freedom and equality.
This may be the only amendment in the original 10 amendments that constituted the Bill of Rights that doesn't come into terribly active play in our lives today.
Last time you looked, this amendment's working really well. The government isn't quartering troops in people's homes very often.
Oops. Sorry. Although maybe they are quartering in people's hotels. So thank you for that, Jenna. So let's talk a little bit about the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, oops. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath and affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized. So there's essentially two parts to the Fourth Amendment. The first half of it is promising that there won't be unreasonable searches and seizures. And by the very way that the amendment is structured, it's not saying that that never would a search without a warrant be unreasonable, although that is certainly the predilection. In the vast majority of situations, you do have a warrant, but sometimes it might be reasonable in emergency situations where somebody's safety is at risk or where there's risk of evidence being destroyed if you took the time to get the warrant. So, so that first part, no unreasonable searches and seizures. And then the second part spells out the requirements to obtain a warrant. And they make a lot of what was stressed was the specificity of what was said in the warrant. It can't be just a theoretical crime might be going on, so gosh, I need a warrant to go see if that crime is going on. And it can't be, it has to tell you where it's at, exactly what you're looking for, exactly what crime you think it is that's being violated, and say why you think that's the case. And you have to swear it to a judge. And this was a reaction to another thing that happened in the lead up to the War for Independence, which was the use of essentially open warrants. So getting back to, the tension, the Parliament would pass a new tax, and then the colonists would basically do everything they could not to pay the taxes illegally. And the taxes were always import or export taxes. And the way that process worked was with an import tax, the ship comes into port, they had these huge customs warehouse where they'd put everything in the customs warehouse until officials had time to count the items and assess the value and then levy the tax. And then likewise on export taxes, you put everything in the warehouse until the officials had a chance to count the stuff and assess the value so that they could levy the tax. Well, colonists started smuggling. They would, come in at night and try to sneak things off ships. They would not land at the usual ports and maybe smuggle things into people's barns and so forth in an effort to get around the taxes. And so they would go to, the customs officials would go to local judges and say, I think that this law is being broken, these taxes aren't being paid, and I have evidence that suggests that they've hidden this stuff in this house or this barn. But the local judges were on the side of the colonists. The local judges didn't think that the taxes were fair either, and so they wouldn't grant the warrants. So Great Britain had warrants at the time that operated similarly to ours, and they were kind of specific, but they made an exception. And they passed these warrants. They went back overseas and got judges on the other side of the pond, British judges, to approve warrants that were open-ended, and they were given to customs officials, and they would last for the life of the king plus 6 months. So essentially, the customs officials, they were told to only use it if they really had evidence and stuff, but essentially it was an open check. So they'd use it kind of randomly, and sometimes they didn't even have any evidence that someone was evading the taxes. They would sometimes just use the warrants to harass somebody who was a rabble-rouser. And so this sense that the king was just willy-nilly coming into people's homes, either having soldiers living there and essentially spying on them, or making a claim that you are breaking the law, really is just a way to ransack your barn or to get into your house, just to harass you. The use of these great warrants, or these open-ended warrants, was probably at the top of the list of things that made the colonists angry. And so the Fourth Amendment was addressing all of that. And let me share with you the video for that. And actually, I need to re-Google this one.
The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects
Against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated.
One of the things that provoked the American Revolution was the British attempt to tax American trade. If truth be told, much of that trade was occurring in violation of English customs laws. In other words, smuggling. What the British did was begin to search American ships, search American homes for these smuggled goods.
The origins of the Fourth Amendment was to stop these general searches, these warrants that basically said, search anyone.
And no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause.
Supported by oath or affirmation.
And particularly describing the place to be searched
and the persons or things to be seized.
The other origin of the Fourth Amendment was seditious libel, was people speaking up against the government.
The soldier would come to the door, they could search the homes, they could take anything. And what the soldiers were actually looking for was signs of an insurrection, signs of disgruntled people.
the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects
shall not
be violated.
Why are houses mentioned above and beyond all other buildings? Because a house is a seat of privacy. If the government is going to intrude upon us, if it's going to enter my house and do a search, if it's going to do those things, it has to act reasonably.
Today's Fourth Amendment is not unlike the original Fourth Amendment. It still governs the extent to which the government can intrude into your property or your privacy.
If you see a suspicious-looking character walking down the street, do you have probable cause to search that individual? Those are judgments that law enforcement officers have to make every single day.
And no warrant.
And no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause.
One of the critical parts of the Fourth Amendment is the exclusionary rule, which says that if the government searches somebody and they shouldn't have, then the evidence can't be used in court.
The exclusionary rule imposes a very substantial cost when someone actually did it.
Very often we know the person is guilty. The government searched, We found the goods, we can see them, and now the person says, but you can't use them against me because you didn't have a warrant. And that's what makes the Fourth Amendment so very controversial.
We also have, as time goes by, an expansion from the tangible items set out in the Fourth Amendment, papers, effects, to intangible items.
The Fourth Amendment was implicated when the Bush administration was wiretapping people in the War on Terror. It's implicated for searches of people's computers, for programs that record your keystrokes when you're typing on your computer, thermal heat sensors to see whether people are growing marijuana in their homes or in their warehouses.
Think about the internet. Think about your cell phone. All of these things now are covered by the Fourth Amendment. And we have to look at what the framers had in mind when it comes to unreasonable searches and seizures by the federal government and realize what makes our Constitution this wonderful document is the fact that it has grown with us as we've grown as a country. If not, then it would just be a piece of paper behind glass.
Okay, let's take a look at the Fifth Amendment. So the Fifth Amendment's got a lot going on. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So there's really 5 separate rights in the Fifth Amendment. There's the first part, which is about if the federal government, and this is one of the few provisions in the Bill of Rights that has not been incorporated to apply to the states. If the federal government is going to charge you with a serious crime, it can't just be a prosecutor alone. The prosecutor has to impanel some regular citizens and present that evidence. So it's called a grand jury because by tradition it's bigger. A grand jury at the federal level is 24 people as opposed to the trial jury, which is 12. And so it represents, it acknowledges the idea that an overzealous prosecutor can ruin your life even if you're not convicted of a crime. The very fact of charging you with a serious crime is going to irreparably cause harm, even if the charges, even if it goes to trial and you're acquitted, even if before trial the charges are dropped, there's going to be some people who think, well, they wouldn't have charged them with a crime unless something was going on. And so in order to restrain that overzealous prosecutors, the prosecutor, if they think somebody has committed a crime, they impanel 24 people. The prosecutor provides why they think the person committed a crime. And it's just the prosecutor's show. Grand juries can be secret, unlike the requirements that are tried in public. And that's actually in the best interest of a defendant, because if they're not going to charge you with a crime, it's better that they're not suspicious. Now, it tends to be the case in modern times on some of these high profile political things that we do know there's a grand jury going on, but it could be secret. So the prosecutor says, here's what I got. Do you think there's enough evidence to go forward? And the grand jury votes, and it's just a majority vote. If a majority of the jury thinks so, then they issue an indictment, which that's the charging instrument of a grand jury. So again, it's a protection against overzealous prosecutors. The Fifth Amendment then goes on to promise that you won't be put twice in jeopardy of life or limb, or the double jeopardy clause. And this stands for the proposition that a sovereign should only get one chance to prove that you committed a crime, that they shouldn't get to try again if they fail. You know, each trial shouldn't be a practice run where eventually, if enough trials, they'll either get the right jury or they'll get better at it. They get one's chance. Now, I worded it a little bit awkwardly. I said that a sovereign should only get one chance. And because we live in a federal system with two sovereigns, they each have their own independent set of laws, it is not considered double jeopardy if, like say, some actions violate simultaneously a state law and a federal law. They're two different, a single action can violate two separate laws. And in those cases, it's not double jeopardy if one of the levels of government prosecutes you and you're acquitted. It's not considered double jeopardy if the other level of government brings charges and goes forward. The double jeopardy clause only attaches once a jury has acquitted. If the trial gets thrown out somewhere along the lines, that's not a strike against the government, because it only happens if the jury actually returned. There have been cases where the jury is out and they call a mistrial, and that doesn't count as double jeopardy because the prosecutor can go again if they want to, because it only happens when a jury has acquitted. So it doesn't count in cases where it's a single action that violated both state and federal law, nor does it count in cases where you've broken both a criminal law and a civil law. If you can be acquitted, but if if somebody wants to sue you, that's not considered a violation of double jeopardy, because this is referring to what the government can do. And it's also implied in the wording, you won't be put twice in jeopardy of life or limb, your life or your freedom. Civil trials by individuals are about property, and it doesn't say you won't be put twice in jeopardy for property. So the famous example of that, of course, is back when O.J. Simpson was tried for the murder of his wife and a friend of hers, and he was acquitted in the criminal trial. But then the family of the family of his ex-wife, it wasn't her, it was the family of the friend of her, sued, and that was not double jeopardy because that was a civil case. Now, where the double jeopardy, I've given all these examples where it doesn't apply. Where it applies, and it applies completely, is once you're acquitted, that's it. It doesn't matter if more evidence comes out. So using the O.J. Simpson case as my example, let's say he's acquitted of the crime, and then he holds a press conference afterwards, and he says, well, of course I did it. Look, I have a video showing me doing it. Then California could not have brought charges again because he had been acquitted. Wouldn't matter how much evidence that there was at that point. An example, a real life example that gives, that illustrates the idea that
Can I ask a question about that?
Of course.
I'm kind of just confused there because obviously I understand what you're saying. It's just obviously there's kind of that like moral yucky feeling when you think about that hypothetical. Wouldn't that be considered technically like proof that you were lying on the stand or suppressing evidence at some point?
Sure, but you were acquitted. And people, here's the thing, people don't come out very often and dance around and talk about how they got away with it, because, I mean, it happens, but the reason that they don't is that people, victims of those crimes, will sue them, and they've just made their job a lot easier. So if O.J. Simpson had held that press conference, the Goldmans, the people who sued him, they won, but it would have been a quicker trial and a larger settlement had he come out and actually admitted it. So you don't have those stark cases of people saying, haha, very often. And the government just gets one chance. So you do have some abuses of it but the abuse of the government being able to go multiple times would be greater, you know, because in a sense, you know, you could have a prosecutor that figures, I'm either going to get the right jury or I'm just going to get better at this. And with each trial, you know, it's probably going to harm the ability of the defendant more to make witness come yet again, you know, to testify on their behalf and so forth. I mean, yeah, you're right. It kind of does sometimes give that feeling, but yeah. The example of when you've committed a single crime that violates a state law and a federal law, and it's not double jeopardy. The Timothy McVeigh case illustrated that. He was the guy who bombed the Oklahoma federal building. And he was, so the federal crime was, I mean, there was the property damage, but the murder crimes, there was actually in that building where 165 people were killed, there were only 8 murder charges that could be brought against him because until relatively recently, murder was not a federal crime of any kind. In fact, at the time that Kennedy was assassinated, there were still no federal laws against murder. So Oswald was arrested under Texas state law, and had Oswald lived, he would have been tried by in Texas state courts under Texas laws against murder. It was after the Kennedy assassination that Congress, first they passed a law that said the killing of a member of Congress or a president or any of their staffs is going to be a federal crime. So like murder, they're not really murder crimes at the federal level because they're talking about killing people who hold a certain position. Whereas state laws say you can't kill a human being regardless of their status. So there were 8 federal counts of murder, 165 counts of first degree murder under Oklahoma. The federal government went first. There's no rule about that, of who gets to go first. The federal government went first. They did secure a conviction, but let's imagine for a moment that they had not. Let's say they messed up something about the trial and the jury acquitted. Although the federal government could not have tried him again, it would not have violated our notions of double jeopardy if the Attorney General of Oklahoma had stood up and said, that's fine because now I am charging you with 165 counts of first degree murder under Oklahoma state law. And that wouldn't be considered double jeopardy. So yeah, it's a lot of weird places where it doesn't apply, but when it applies so absolutely that it, you know, can cause problems like Gabriel was talking about, where you feel like, well, that's kind of an injustice too. Okay. Then there's the self-incrimination clause that you can't be compelled in a criminal case to be a witness against yourself. So that stands for the idea that you don't have to help the government convict you. And so it's out of this clause that the idea of invoking the Fifth Amendment or taking the Fifth comes, because you can't be coerced to testify against yourself, which means if you don't want to talk to police or you don't want to testify at trial, you don't have to. That's one of the things that's a little bit different in the specification of rights between the United States and Great Britain. Great Britain still doesn't have a corollary to the double jeopardy clause. It's not that they will beat something, you know, it's not like if you're on the stand and you don't answer the question, they go up and punch you until you talk. But the implications of it is that lawyers and judges can tell juries to weigh the fact that the person didn't want to speak on their own behalf in assessing guilt. So in a British trial, you know, during closing arguments, the lawyer for the prosecution will say, I don't know why an innocent person didn't want to get in the stand and talk about it. Wouldn't you want to take the opportunity to clear yourself? That can't happen in a US trial. If a lawyer, a prosecutor, or a judge during jury instructions even hints at assuming guilt because they invoke their Fifth Amendment right, that's the quickest way to get a mistrial, because the court has long ago said to assume guilt because you've invoked a right is like not having the right. So prosecutors cannot comment on the fact that they haven't taken the stand, and that's how it ends up playing out.
So so knowing prosecutors, you know, can't obviously address it, there's not really anything in place to prevent like a jury from on their own deciding that, though, is there?
No, but man, that is one of the only things that, you know, they can make all other kinds of improper remarks and the judge just tells the jury not to consider it. That is one area, if you make any kind of statement as a prosecutor like that, that gets thrown out so quick, you know.
I definitely, I don't know about as far as being on jury, but I definitely have heard people say, you know, something as simple as, you know, if they're not giving their alibi or something, then that sounds suspicious.
I'm sure juries do talk about it. But the government wasn't using that, I guess, is how I would, you know, that if juries come up with that on their own, that's their business, but the government can't put its thumb on the scale by telling them you ought to think about that. So yeah, it wouldn't invalidate what a jury talked about if somebody was bothered by the fact that they invoked their Fifth Amendment right, as long as it did not come at the suggestion of the government.
That's rough. It's like the Fifth Amendment struggles to exist, at least that part.
I mean, sure. Absolutely. The fourth clause that has a right in it in the Fifth Amendment is that you won't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Meaning, and it's important to point out what it's not saying. This is actually an acknowledgement that sometimes government's going to impact your lives in really big ways. It's acknowledging that sometimes government's going to take your property, sometimes it's going to take your liberty, and indeed, it's an acknowledgement that sometimes government can rightfully take your life, but not without there being some sort of fair process in place. It can't willy-nilly do any of these things. It can do them as long as there's due process in place. And we're going to spend a lot of time a little bit later in the semester talking about, well, what is due process? For now, just think of due process as government being consistent and having some fair procedures set up before it impacts your life in those ways.
If we're going to talk about it later, I won't ask too much, but I just wanted to know, like, 'cause since I don't know exactly what due process would mean here, does that include, like, especially historically with something like Civil War, whenever people were, like, kind of executed for something like desertion?
That would come under under like the military code of, what do they call it? Military Code of Justice. War is different. I'm sure there are some restrictions upon that. It would, I mean, that would be so context laden. You know, there might be times when I don't think if you're certain circumstances, really, there wouldn't be much excuse for it, but there might be times when it could be justified, but it certainly could be questioned and tried under a courts martial for sure. By the way, the Department of a grand jury indictment, there's this long phrase that talks about, except in cases of the land or naval forces, if you're serving in the military, the Fifth Amendment says you don't have to have the formality of the 24 people impaneled. essentially that means a courts martial will suffice to be charged as opposed to a grand jury proceeding in the military during when in actual service at time of war or public danger. It's abbreviated due process. And then the final one, what we call the takings clause, is an acknowledgement that sometimes government needs to take your private property for the use of the public. Governments historically all over the world all retain a right called eminent domain, meaning that, yeah, we might recognize private property rights, but there are times when the government says, we just need that private property. And even, in our system that strongly protects private property, we acknowledge that sometimes the government can take it, but they have to be fairly compensated. So this is usually, what we usually know it is in the context of real property, real estate. So universities like IUP are good examples. So, they were established a long time ago when you didn't have to park a bunch of cars and they didn't have as many buildings and students. Dallas, do you have a question?
I just want to let you know it's 12:16.
Oh my goodness. You are to be thanked. Everybody else is thanking you. And you guys have a fabulous weekend. I'll get the quiz online as soon as I can. So thank you.
Thank you.
I will see you next time.